So let's go to another place you recently were in, which was China. What is your definition of success? What is a realistic goal for American foreign policy towards China?
There's, at least in the near term, maybe even in the lifetimes of most people in this room, I don't think a clear finish line. This is more about getting to a place where we have peaceful and maybe somewhat more productive coexistence between us. Because the bottom line is this, China's not going away, we're not going away. So in the first instance, we have to find a way to coexist and coexist peacefully. We know we're in an intense competition. We talked about the competition to try to shape the post-Cold War era. At the same time, we are determined that that competition not veer into conflict, which would be terrible for everyone involved. And it starts with some basics. It starts with actually building back sustained lines of communication. That was the purpose of the trip I made at the president's behest, to start to build that back. And I think you're going to start to see more engagement in both directions, with senior Chinese officials coming here, senior Americans going there. Second, it is about dealing directly, clearly, candidly with the profound differences that we have. And at the very least, making sure that there's a greater understanding of where we're coming from, what our intent is, and hopefully learning a little bit more from them about where they're coming from and what their intent is. And then finally, there are areas where, if it's in our mutual interest, we should find ways to cooperate. We talked about that as well. But this is a long-term competition. As I said, I don't think there's a finish line, but we want to make sure that in that competition, we're in a position of strength where we are, as I said, able to shape what comes next. And I think, from my perspective at least, we are approaching this from a position of strength, precisely because of the investments we've made in our competitiveness, precisely because of the convergence that we built with key partners in Europe, key partners in Asia, on how to approach the challenges that China poses.
So I'm listening to you closely, and I was struck by your language, because you said our goal is to coexist peacefully. Well, I'm old enough, as are several people in this room, to remember where peaceful coexistence was the phrase that for decades dominated or characterized U.S.-Soviet relations. What are we to read into that?
Only that, again, neither of us is going away, so at a minimum, that has to be, I think, the baseline. As I said, we're determined to make sure that in everything that we're doing, the two different worlds that I tried to sketch briefly and what they might look like, the free, open, prosperous, secure world that we're trying to build, a somewhat different and more liberal model that others, including China, are driving toward, that our vision prevails.
But implicit in the phrase peaceful coexistence is less what you're trying to accomplish and more what you're trying to avoid.
No.
That was true of the Cold War. Do you think that's a fair characterization of the U.S.-China relationship? It's more what we're trying to avert rather than what we can realistically accomplish?
I think it's both. I think it's both. I think we have a responsibility. We have an obligation that we hear from around the world to manage the relationship responsibly, and that gets to the peaceful coexistence part. We hear this demand signal everywhere. But that doesn't mean that we're standing still. It doesn't mean that we're accepting that as the goal. But it is the foundation. And from there, as I say, we're in a competition. We want to make sure that in that competition to shape this new era, our vision prevails.
So let me raise what could be the greatest threat to that ability, which is Taiwan. And if I may quote Secretary of State Blinken, I always hate it when people quote me, by the way. Last October, you said, referring to Taiwan, what's changed is this: the decision by the government in Beijing that the status quo is no longer acceptable, that they wanted to speed up the process by which they would pursue unification. You just spent time there. You spoke to Wang Yi, you spoke to the foreign minister, you spoke to, obviously, President Xi. What take did you make on their views on Taiwan? Did you come away with any different sense of their either aspirations or, more important, timetables, risk propensities?
Let's start with this. I think my opening premise is that for the better part of 5 decades, this is a challenge and issue that we've actually managed responsibly. And doing that was premised on a few very basic principles. One is that any differences between Beijing and Taiwan would be resolved peacefully, that neither side would engage in unilateral changes to the status quo, and the result of that, the result of a consistent policy through multiple administrations, Republican, Democrat alike, founded on one China, has meant that we have managed it responsibly. I think what changed is this, at least in our judgment. Obviously, China has a different narrative. But if you go back to 2016, not last year, not just in recent months, but if you go back to 2016, we've seen Beijing taking actions that suggest that the status quo was not acceptable. And we've seen that in some of the military operations that they've been engaged in, the deployment of forces, the exercises, the missile tests, et cetera.
Sure.
We've seen that in the economic coercion exerted against Taiwan, and for that matter, exerted against countries that have relationships with Taiwan. We've seen that in the effort to pry Taiwan out of the international system. And all of this is a stirring of the pot that is antithetical to the preservation of the status quo. So one of the things that we try to communicate very clearly is not only the consistency of our policy and our approach and our determination to maintain the status quo, but also the concerns not just of the United States, but of countries around the world about anything, any actions that would disrupt it. And there's a very clear reason for this, even as China, of course, asserts that these are sovereign issues that should be relevant to no one else, and of interest to no one else. We all know this, 50% of commercial traffic, trade, goes through that strait every single day. 50% of container traffic in the world. 70% of the semiconductors that we use from everything from our smartphones to our washing machines to our automobiles made on Taiwan. If there were to be a crisis as a result of actions that either side takes that offline, you've got potentially a global economic crisis. It's one of the reasons, maybe the main reason, that country after country is going to both of us and saying we expect the responsible management of this issue to be sustained. That's exactly where we are, and I tried to share that very clearly and directly with our Chinese counterparts.
Okay, so I agree with you on the stakes, and I agree that China over recent decades has, shall we say, moved to change the status quo in certain ways by what it's done militarily and diplomatically. So 4 times your boss, the President of the United States, has said that the U.S. would help defend Taiwan if it were attacked by China, and 4 times the White House staff has walked him back. So what is our policy, and why aren't we basically telling China within the context of one China policy, you've done things to increase the threat, we're going to do things to increase the your understanding that you cannot move against Taiwan with impunity?
Richard?
Yes, sir.
We continue to be guided by the One China policy based on the 3 communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, and the 6 assurances. That hasn't changed, and that won't change.
Mr. Secretary, we can do all that and still increase the certainty that with which we communicate to China that we are there for Taiwan if they use coercion.
And I think it's evident not only in what we're saying, but also in what we're doing, that we are there for Taiwan. Under the Taiwan Relations Act, we've had a long-standing policy of making sure that we could do what's necessary to help Taiwan defend itself. That policy and the sort of rheostat on it also depends a lot on what Beijing is doing or not doing. And that was designed in from the get-go, including in the communiques.
Okay, let me raise one other aspect of China. So while you were there, you raised the fentanyl issue.
Yeah.
And I read the language closely, and I have spent some time in that same building you are. And this was a triumph of diplomatic, diplo-speak.
Thank you.
Where the 2 sides agreed to explore the creation of a working group. Love that. So there was that. And then I saw that China basically, however you say not now or take a hike in Mandarin, on establishing mill crisis communications. So my question is, on those 2 issues, am I misreading it? And then on other issues, for example, China's willingness to participate in the next round of nuclear arms control talks. The last time I raised it with a senior Chinese official, he basically said, no way, we've got to build up our nuclear arms. We're not interested. Do you get the sense that when China's looking at all these issues, where did you come away with optimism? Was it any of these issues? Was it possibly Ukraine? Is there any area where, again, you see some potential upside in China's diplomatic openness?
Well, first, just taking the issues that you mentioned, let's start with fentanyl. And there's a good reason to start with fentanyl. And in a sense, it's really worth pausing on this for a second because, as I suspect most people know in this room, the number one killer of Americans aged 18 to 49 is fentanyl. So if you start from that premise, it makes sense that you'd want to be focusing a lot of your time and resources and effort on that, and we are. And indeed, as I mentioned, in just a couple of weeks' time, we'll be moving forward with a broader international coalition to deal with this. And it's a problem and a challenge that we've been facing for some time. We're doing it holistically, by which I mean there's a lot that has to go on in the United States, including reducing demand, dealing with treatment. At the same time, major law enforcement challenges. We have our border and making sure, to the best of our ability, that synthetic opioids can't get over the border with impunity. There's a lot of technology that goes into that. Working with Mexico, where the synthetic opioids are created. But there's, of course, as everyone knows, a China dimension to this problem, because the precursors that go into the fabrication of fentanyl are right now primarily made in China, and they are then diverted, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not knowingly, to criminal enterprises that turn them into fentanyl close to our border and then send them into our country. So it's profoundly in our interest to see if we can get cooperation from China to deal with this problem. We've had some successes in the past, including their decision a few years ago to stop the exportation of fentanyl itself. But the chemical precursors are where the problem is now. There's a lot that goes into this in terms of trying to elicit that cooperation, even as we are taking action against any institution, company, individuals we find that are engaged in this illicit trade. I believe, based on the sentence that you read, that we're actually getting to a place where we might actually get practical cooperation from China. And this is not as a favor to us. This is because what we're seeing around the world is a demand signal, because fentanyl is now hitting many more countries. We've been the canary in the coal mine. Our market is actually saturated. The criminal enterprises engaged in synthetic opioids are now trying to make markets in other places, including in Europe, including in Asia. And so more and more countries are now raising their voice and saying, we need action on this, we need cooperation on this. I don't think China's going to be immune to that. So I have some modest hope that we can find a way to elicit their cooperation.